I want to firstly add my voice to the others around this House in congratulating the Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull West and Hessel for both securing and bringing forward this debate today on this very, very important issue. I also want to echo and agree with many of the comments and the contributions across the House, and it's really good to see everybody speaking, I think, in a very similar way in support of trying to look at what action needs to be taken in terms of the women who are currently suffering some horrendous things due to this issue. Unfortunately, I didn't have the opportunity to participate in the Westminster Hall debate, so for me to listen to the very many contributions has been very, very informative. Some of the speeches have been very technical, questions have been asked, and I think it will be very useful for us all in terms of feeding back to our constituents to hear the response to those. But I also welcome the very specific recommendations, particularly the recommendations in the opening contribution by the Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull West and Hessel, and I would fully support those. There has been some discussion in the House, and there does seem to be a difference of opinion in relation to whether or not this procedure should be suspended while the audit and other matters are being resolved. And I think many of us, I suppose, are somewhat confused about why it would be considered that this risk was acceptable. Because I think when, like many people, I suspect many of the MPs across the House and across this chamber, I first came to hear of this issue when I was contacted via social media by a number of constituents, and I subsequently met with some of those constituents face to face. And I particularly welcome the contribution by the Honourable Member for New Forest East in outlining the very specific circumstances of his constituents, and it was a very similar story. And when you sit and you listen to what many of these women have suffered, they tell a very, very strong story of pain, about the incredible impact on their lives, on their families, on their marriages and on their relationships. And it is a powerful story that they tell. And when you hear those stories, you do ask yourself, well, look, their pain, that risk of what they have suffered, how does that justify, or how is that justified by those where this actually does work? And I think there are serious concerns, and I share those concerns in relation to those. I know many of us are appalled when we hear about the stories and the experiences of those women. Many of those lives have been absolutely blighted by these operations and procedures. Many aspects of concern have been articulated. I don't want to just reiterate what has already been said, but I do want to focus on two of the elements that I don't think have been touched on in any detail really today. But the first one is the need to ensure that all of the women impacted are identified, fully supported, and given the highest quality care and intervention possible at this stage. To me, that is a priority issue, because I really feel that this is an issue where there's two very clear aspects. The first one is where we are right now, and what these women are suffering right now, and what we can do to help and support them to try to find resolution. And I think that certainly will require highest levels of expertise and support through that particular journey. Many of the medical interventions, as we've heard, are complicated, and given the previous experience of medical procedures, as outlined already by some of the members, many of these women are understandably deeply apprehensive and worried about undergoing further necessary procedures. So the right experience and qualifications and a wraparound support service are critical, not only to get the best medical outcomes, but to build confidence with the many women who have been let down by the profession, by the interventions in the past. And I do want to empathise with those women who know that they will have to undergo even more medical interventions, even though they've had such an horrific experience and are suffering the consequences of those previous interventions. In relation to the issue on the suspension, I have written to the authorities in Northern Ireland. I've written to the Secretary of State to request the suspension pending the outcome of the audit and the review. And I am always very aware in the situation that we are not doctors, or many of us are not doctors, we're not the medical professions, and we are told, and the responses to that correspondence very much has been, look, we have to listen, even in terms of the department and the civil service involved in those departments, we do listen to the medical professionals in relation to these matters. And that's why I do think it's important that NICE do move quicker, that they do move this forward, because that's going to be critical in terms of the frontline care advice and the pathways that are followed for the women presenting with issues. But secondly, I think the other aspect of this, which we have discussed at some length here today as well, are the critical questions of how did this happen and why was it not picked up at an earlier stage. And I welcomed the review that the Secretary of State announced, because it will look at some of those issues. But we do need to understand how we have got to this position. And in speaking to my constituents, and in fact some people from right across Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland lobby in relation to this, there's a very common experience in terms of the problems that they have had. And that common experience is that they were not taken seriously enough at all stages. And when complaints were raised, even in situations of extreme and chronic pain, and when those complications were raised to the medical professionals, they were very often dismissed. Now, we've heard reference to the database. There should have been a database and a collation of that information at an earlier stage. That does need to happen, and I fully support that happening at a UK level, because I think, as articulated, that is the best way to get a wider sense of what's happening in relation to this matter. But it is very worrying that individually hundreds and thousands of women across the United Kingdom were presenting with complications from these procedures, and yet nobody joined up those dots until a very, very late stage. I'm glad that it's happening now. I'm glad that there's a review about this. But many women have had to suffer this for too many years without the dots being joined and action being taken. It's not acceptable that women presenting with problems were told by some GPs or other medical practitioners that perhaps it was just women's problems. These types of complications that generally happen, something to do are connected to the issues around the menopause. And it was dismissed, and women felt dismissed, and that their issues were not being taken seriously. And that is wrong, and it's unacceptable. And we hear a lot at the moment, similar to Northern Ireland, I'm sure it's the same right across the United Kingdom, about patient-focused care and the patient-focused experience through the health service. And yet, in all of this, and the stories that I have heard, that common experience of not being taken seriously, of it not being a patient-focused experience for them, needs to be addressed, and addressed urgently. I just want to touch very, very briefly in relation to the review. I'm looking forward to the outcome of that review and some of the actions that have been discussed around the audit as well, the setting up of the database. But I think what's really, really important is that not only do we identify what went wrong, but that we are identifying clear actions about how we stop this from happening again. And I think learning from those mistakes of the past, making sure actions are identified, and making sure that we progress in that. And lastly, I do want to thank the advocates who have done huge work to raise awareness about this issue right across the United Kingdom and in Northern Ireland.
Kevin Hollinrick.
Thank you.